We now welcome Brendan Vogt onto the show. He is a writer for the DNVR.com. How's it going, Brendan?
I'm well, guys. How you doing today?
Really, really good. Matt will attest to this. The Denver Nuggets are probably one of the teams I'm the most fascinated with, just through their roster and especially their performance in the bubble. So it's a pleasure to have you on and really just pick your brain about this team headed into the new season.
Well, I'm excited to be here. There's this is the first offseason that I've been here with this much turnover. So the Nuggets, that's a team we sort of known a lot about going into each season. And there are some questions to answer this time around. So excited to chop it up.
So let's reflect on the previous season. And I want to get to Jamal Murray. I think really other than Damian Lillard, I would say ahead of him, Jamal Murray is probably the biggest revelation in the bubble in terms of his performance. What did you make of kind of his transformation in this bubble environment? I mean, I think for those who follow the Nuggets or just follow the NBA in general, you kind of see this coming, but especially under the weird circumstances,
sure,
he performed phenomenally. What do you attest that to exactly?
Yeah, so the Jamal Murray case is interesting in the bubble. Obviously, we know he shot lights out. You know, if he were to sustain that type of efficiency across a full season, full postseason, I mean, this is better than Steph Curry stuff. And this is a guy who's a career 35% shooter from three. So I think a lot of folks look at the shooting first and foremost as a potential sort of outlier statistic, because as you mentioned, they're playing in that weird context in the bubble. And that is true, right? With no fans, not having to travel into opposing environments, it's probably a little easier to maintain a hot streak. And we know Jamal has that talent. But I would stress that leap Nuggets fans are articulating, what comprised that was far more than just shooting. Jamal came into the postseason, I think he told us 12 pounds heavier. You could see the added muscle. And all of a sudden, this was a guy that was getting to the line in ways he hadn't done before, getting to the rim in ways he hadn't done before, was up for the challenge defensively, and his playmaking improved. So I would definitely concede that the shooting jump was somewhat of an outlier effect, but I think every Nuggets fan knows that Jamal did make a leap of some kind in those playoffs, and they're very excited to see how that looks across a full season.
And heading into this upcoming season, where do you think he fits in that pecking order? Do you see him now? All eyes are on him. I mean, before it was kind of like a secret to mainstream fans of the league per se, but now kind of the secret's out due to his performance. So is there be any added pressure on him to be that number two on this team? Because that the Nuggets are going to have a pretty big target on their back. I mean, I don't think in my opinion, I don't think they're no longer just kind of a sleeper team in the West. I think they're a perennial Western Conference power. So with him taking this new role on this team, how do you think he'll adjust, especially with a longer 72 game schedule if COVID permits?
It'll be interesting to see how he approaches this regular season. Is he trying to be that guy they needed him to be, and he successfully was in the postseason? Or is he just trying to be the lead guard on a team that has won a lot of regular season games, with him playing, let's be honest, with a much lower baseline than we saw in that bubble. In the regular season, consistency's been his issue. He's not want to string 20-point games together. One night it's 30, the next it's maybe 13 or 14. I think Jamal is a guy that, for all of his talent, there is a mental thing there, almost a Jimmy Butler effect. I think he's more mentally tough and cut out for competition than he is even talented, if that makes sense. So what I'm getting at is I think he's going to elevate his game when the playoffs come around. But I don't know if that means he's going to be a top-tier point guard or an all-star caliber point guard in the regular season. There's just so many of those already. I'd be surprised if he plays at that level in the regular season. But that said, fellas, I think this is a guy who's going to be able to turn it on when the going gets tough.
Brandon, I'm curious your thoughts on the Nuggets offseason overall. I think most people, including myself, are pretty positive about it in that they kept their core together. They, initially were in those talks to acquire Drew Holiday. Some say it may be kind of a blessing in disguise that they didn't get him with what the Pelicans were able to get for him as an asset. How would you grade the offseason for the Nuggets? Do you think kind of no news is good news, or do you think that there are some things that they might have missed out on?
It's interesting, man. The Jeremy Grant's personal decision, that is an interesting one to evaluate. He walks away to Detroit at 360, and we learned that Denver actually did match that contract. Which I know based off conversations I've had with that team, that's not how they value him. They were willing to overpay him a bit, I think, because of a specific role he fits in Denver. It's so specific, guys, that I would even just point to the Clippers series. Yes, Kawhi kind of choked a bit, but Grant just did a really good job. He was well suited physically to defend a Kawhi type. In the regular season, he was a bench player, and he wasn't particularly great. So adding JaMychal Green, I think, is a great, sort of fill-in for the regular season. Losing Grant, I think, would matter should they find themselves in another Game 7 against the Clippers. Jrue Holiday, you don't want to pay as much as the Bucks did for Jrue Holiday. He's become almost slightly overrated in this conversation. But let's just say it this way. There was a world in which Denver felt like they could have retained Jeremy Grant at a much more reasonable price, and they could have obtained Jrue Holiday. They felt like they were the front runners prior to the Bucks coming in way over the top. So let's just say maybe it was Monte Morris, Gary Harris, and a couple of picks. Then they would have felt like they're adding Jrue Holiday to that talented core without really giving up much of it. So there was a world, I think, in which they might have walked into this season feeling like they are arguably favorites right behind the Lakers to win the title. And that didn't work out that way. So it'll be interesting to see how missing out on Jrue and missing out on Jeremy Grant affect them. I still think they win a ton of regular season games, though.
Absolutely. I would definitely agree with that. I'm also curious your thoughts on Michael Porter Jr., because oddly enough, like in my opinion, it seems like Denver has no interest in moving him. And yet I keep hearing, and maybe this is just, NBA Twitter overreactions or just people being excited in the off season, but I do hear his name brought up in like trade rumors and things like this, talking about all kinds of trade value. And I don't really get the sense that Denver has any interest in moving him at all. Could you speak to maybe some of those rumors that are out there, maybe erroneously so, and his trade value, and also if there is any interest on Denver's part from moving from him?
Sure. So full disclosure in the process, I am credentialed. I do get to talk to the team. I wouldn't describe myself as one of the 2 to 3 newsbreakers. If you're in the Nuggets world, Harrison Wind, Mike Singer, they're really plugged in. That said, an open secret, and even I know, Denver's not keen on moving Michael Porter Jr. They're just not. If that trade happens, I think it would be a big surprising move. The reason you're seeing, I think, this conversation is because from an outside perspective, as Nuggets fans like to say, a casual fan perspective, the feeling is let's get another star in Denver, right? That's a good young team that needs a third guy. What's their shiniest asset? It's Michael Porter Jr. So from a trade machine on your couch perspective, I get it, but I can confirm what you're getting at. Like, the Nuggets are not eager to move this guy at all.
I want to get your opinion on the Nuggets in terms of a lot of people consider it a massive upset and defeating the Clippers. Just reflecting on that series and moving on to this season, what will that series mean moving forward? Is that going to be kind of like a rite of passage, a significant point in time that this team's going to actually be able to carry into not only this upcoming season, but future seasons? Or do you think it might have been not necessarily like a fluke, but just maybe a point in time that, the roster might change, things happen, and that win in the bubble against the Clippers specifically may not mean as much? I guess what I'm asking is, what are the long-term consequences of that?
Well, I think it can be both, right? I don't think there's any world in which the Nuggets complete consecutive 3-1 comebacks in a normal playoff setting, right? There were some outlier dynamics in play. That said, the Nuggets still bested the odds-on title favorite before the Lakers had that great postseason in a 7-game series. And Nuggets Nation knows well, and Nuggets players have talked about this publicly. The rap on them is that they're soft. The other contenders in the league going into that postseason, they don't fear Denver. In fact, many of them probably had them circled as a matchup they'd prefer to have as they work their way to that Western Conference Finals team. Specifically, matchup, I should say. specifically the Clippers, who really felt like the Nuggets didn't belong in their league. The Clippers liked the idea that they had a bunch of dogs and playoff tested guys, and the Nuggets were pushovers. I think if there's one thing you learned about Denver in this playoffs, is that's not the case. Just because they don't have guys who post Jimmy Butler-esque videos of them draining sweat from their T-shirts online doesn't mean they don't have a bunch of dogs, a bunch of guys that are ready to go, and they think they can play with everyone. So whether they're right, whether they're too young and naive for their own good, I mean, Denver just feels like they can go toe-to-toe with any of these guys, and I think that series is just another notch in their belt in that regard.
I want to get your opinion. You were at the Nuggets media day before you hopped on the call with us. What do you get of the mindset of this team headed into this season, just in terms of the COVID restrictions? As you know, other sports are being hammered with this. We're seeing games being canceled left and right. The NBA is moving out of the bubble. How do you think they're going to adjust to this new paradigm of, possibly their team getting COVID, no fans, the shortened schedule, just kind of the weirdness of this season? It's a lot different than going to Florida for 3 months.
Sure.
How do you think the team is adjusting to the new dynamic?
That's a great question. I think they're trying very, very hard to treat this as business as usual. But of course, we all know that's not the case. I think Luka Doncic was asked recently what he thinks the key is going to be to contending this season, and he said whichever team has the least amount of infected players. And I don't know if that was, in jest. I didn't really hear the quote, but he's not wrong. This is not a bubble. NBA players like to go out. This is what they had in place in Orlando worked so well, and hats off to them. But they got a lot of credit for achieving something that these other leagues could not have done, right? The NBA was wrapping up their postseason in a bubble environment, but you can't conduct an entire regular season under those circumstances. So I think the players are trying very hard to approach this like it's any other season, but as everyone knows, it's just not. And, Portland had to close their training facility today because of multiple positive diagnoses in their organization. So it's going to affect this entire season from start to finish.
I want to ask you a follow-up, just the seriousness of the virus itself, because correct me if I'm wrong, and please do. From seeing kind of a overall layout of all sports, the majority of athletes that get this virus, they seem to recover. And so far, and we'll have to see in years to come, there hasn't been any long-term consequences in terms of those athletes getting infected and them seeing like a diminish of their athletic ability and their overall health. So I guess my question is, do you think the players is there still a fear of getting this virus overall, or is this a situation in which, hey, I'm going to get it, I'll most likely recover, I'll be all right, and I'll be back on the team? What do you think?
It's a good question. I don't have any insight as to how specific Nuggets players feel about this. I would only say that I think often from the outside, we like to group players together like it's a Borg, right? Like they all have one collective opinion.
Sure.
And that, of course, is not the case, right? So there are going to be some guys here who I'd imagine are not too worried about this, that feel they're in prime physical shape. They're either not going to catch this virus, or they're going to be fine if they do. But there's also Karl Anthony Towns, who we know has lost 7 family members, guys, to COVID, which is nothing short of tragic. And he has expressed that going forward, his top priority and top concern now is about doing everything he can to make sure that the rest of his family is safe. And he has described basketball as therapy for him in the past. And he said, I'm not going to be able to call it that now, looking baseline, not seeing my mother there. So important to remember that all these guys are going to feel differently about this, and that, the player base, it's just a bunch of individuals that comprise that.
Yeah, kind of much like our country, in different areas, different people, different groups, all feel different about this.
Exactly.
For sure. Yeah. I wanted to ask you, kind of piggybacking off of this, unique season that we're coming upon. I think you're spot on, mentioning that we can't really hold a full regular season in a bubble. I think also it's going to be good for the mental health of the players that we not do it that way for an entire regular season or attempt that. Do you think that the Nuggets specifically, with a younger core like they have, in any way, I mean, maybe do they have a little bit more stamina for a season like this? Any specific advantages they might have over a team like, say, the Lakers or the Clippers that have some veterans on there that, outside of the COVID discussion, even there's been so much talk about them resting players anyway, as we start with the season.
I mean, yeah, first of all, it's a bunch of younger guys, so they don't all necessarily have families of their own. And I do think that sort of drives a lot of response to this type of stuff. But to your point, Jamal Murray, Michael Porter Jr., these are guys who, the former's coming off of the very best basketball of his career, where he was one of the 5 best players in the playoffs, bar none. The latter who, secrets out the Nuggets season is really all about his progression. Can he be a third star? They're chopping at the bit to get this thing going, right? I'm sure they were excited to see family. Jamal Murray expressed how much he enjoyed being home in Canada and working out with his brother. But I think these guys are ready to go and ready to play basketball. That's at the forefront of their minds, as young competitive dudes. So it's definitely possible. I think this team is still hungry. I don't think they walk away from that bubble experience exhausted. I wouldn't know. I'm just guessing. I think they walk away hungry and feeling like they're this close to contending for a title.
Agreed. I mean, I could definitely see this season being something like, back in the early 2010s when Chicago took the 1 seed in the East. They were a younger, more hungry team, you could argue, than the Miami Heat. And so they eclipsed them for that 1 seed. I could see that happening for the Nuggets over the Lakers and Clippers just because of the rest that might be happening, right. A little bit of championship fatigue maybe from the Lakers. You never know. Obviously, it's early. We got to wait and see some games first. But the other thing that I really wanted to ask you about, because it's such a curiosity to the NBA as a whole, is if you could tell us anything about Bol Bol, his projection for playing time this year, his role on the team this year. Do you see his role expanding this year? How's he coming along?
I think he's in contention for both, backup big and backup wing minutes. The team doesn't necessarily see him as a center. I know some people might have just heard me say wing, and they're wondering if I misspoke. I didn't. They think he has that sort of skill set. And let's say for argument's sake, guys, that Will Barton is being viewed as a shooting guard this year, either starting or backing up Gary. Well, who is that backup wing now that Grant's gone, now that Torrey Craig is left for Milwaukee? Maybe PJ Dozier, the guard, or Bol Bol, the center, sort of takes a step outside of their comfort zone and fills that spot. Michael Malone told us today that in terms of getting creative defensively, they're going to think about ways to get Bol Bol in there as the backline defender, including going to his own defense. So does Bol crack the rotation? I don't know. But in a weird season in which guys might be resting, we might see some load management, coaches get creative. Do we see Bol Bol? I think he's slowly introduced into what Denver wants to do starting this season and going forward.
One last question before we let you go. In terms of fans in attendance, I know that the Golden State Warriors, their goal is to have 50% capacity, COVID testing, everybody that enters their facility, but, just California put out a massive lockdown, stay-at-home order. So I don't know how achievable that is. But I guess as the vaccines are rolling out and everything is kind of organically changing, and hopefully for the positive, do you have any insight regarding the Nuggets specifically wanting to get fans into their building, or are they primarily focused on not having any fans returning into the arena this season?
Yeah, the team actually announced and confirmed there will be no fans in Ball Arena this season, at least as of now. So they're one of the many teams that will be operating without that source of revenue and without that home court advantage. So it'll be really funky, guys. And I don't even know yet if media will be able to be in there. But obviously, like, the best part of seeing a game in an arena is the atmosphere. And being in there without fans, if I'm so lucky, would be nothing short of bizarre. And we can't pretend this will be the same for players. It just won't. Playing without us, for the Nuggets' perspective, a guy like Jamal Murray. Now he played so well without the fans in the playoffs, so maybe it's fine. But he feeds off that energy. He feeds off that crowd. Those guys won't have that advantage. So we'll see how it shakes out.
Do you see, just a follow up to that, do you see like a bubble adaptation for a lot of NBA arenas in terms of incorporating the digital fans, virtual fans? Is that something that you see a lot of arenas employing just to have a little bit sense of normalcy?
It's possible. It's possible. I do think that, a lot of what the NBA did in the bubble in terms of presentation really worked, in my opinion. The court just looked cool. They made it they filled up the space well. It didn't seem so empty. That'll be a unique challenge, I think, for each team respectively within their arenas. I don't know. I haven't heard what the NBA is planning, but I'm sure they'll get creative and try some way to substitute for that atmosphere.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Really enjoyed your insight. Please let our listeners know where we can find you on social media and any upcoming projects you have for the end of this year as well as 2021.
Well, I appreciate you having me, guys. It was a pleasure. You can follow our team account at DNVR_Nuggets. Myself, Harrison Wynn, Adam Mata, as all of our content goes up there. You can follow me on Twitter at Brendan Vogt, VOGT. And check out thednvr.com. We're behind a paywall, but if you're a Nuggets fan, I really believe, the content we're putting out is worth your money. And, there's a lot of benefits to being a subscriber and a member. It's not just about reading our content. There's member discounts at the bar. There's discounts in our merch locker. There's a DNVR member Discord, so you can shop it up with us and our members. And starting next week, we're going to kick off our player preview series. We're going to go through each player on the roster, a fun video series that will be both in front and behind the paywall. Check us out at thednvr.com.
Awesome. Thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciate the chat.
My pleasure, gentlemen.
Yeah, thank you, Brendan. It's a pleasure.